unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Over the past 12 months, tales of spies and spycraft have complicated India's relationships with several Western partners. In recent months, both Canada and the United States have alleged that India's Foreign Intelligence Agency was involved in a complex plot to identify and target Sikh separatists who were citizens of those countries. In India, these allegations have, in turn, revealed deep skepticism about the actions of Western spy agencies and the negative role they've played in India and across the global South. A new book, Spying in South Asia, Britain, the United States, and India's Secret Cold War, offers the first comprehensive history of US and UK intelligence operations in the Indian subcontinent. The author of this book is Paul McGarr, a lecturer in intelligence studies at King's College London. To talk more about his new book and the West's 50-year battle to win the hearts and minds of Indians, I am pleased to welcome Paul to the show for the very first time. Paul, thank you so much for coming on, and congrats on the book.
Thank you, Milan. That's very kind. And as I said, I'm a big fan of Grand Tamasha, so it's wonderful to finally appear on the show.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your book over the last week or so, and I want to begin with something you point out at the very beginning, which is that your book, Spying in South Asia, is one of the first scholarly analyses of interventions made by the intelligence and security services of Britain and the United States in post-colonial India. Now, you know, as a scholar of intelligence, that intelligence work is by definition opaque, often difficult to penetrate. Tell us a little bit about how you gathered material for what ended up in this book.
Thanks, Milan. Yeah, it is an interesting question because intelligence is quite a difficult subject to research and to write about. The process actually started, I wrote a book for Cambridge University Press, which looked at the Cold War in the Indian subcontinent and looked at the United States and the United Kingdom's involvement in that Cold War from 1947 through to the mid-1960s. And while I was researching and writing that book, I came across lots of information on secret intelligence that couldn't quite make it into the book. It didn't really fit with the narrative. I didn't have enough space. But that sort of provoked my interest, really. And then I began to read lots of memoirs from former intelligence officers that vaguely referred to India and Pakistan. And so there was some background information on that. And then I dug a little bit further and found out that in official archives, both in the United Kingdom, the United States, and in India to some extent, there was a secret intelligence information available. Often it wasn't released formally. It would often be in treasury files or economic files or private papers of individuals. But there was a fragmented story that is a question I sort of refer to a bit like putting together a jigsaw piece, really, where the pieces have been thrown onto the floor and scattered. It was trying to find out individual pieces and trying to put them together into a coherent story. But using memoir, using some official histories, and using some published sources, which I found hadn't really been mined before. So a good example of that is the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru. Huge volume of a body of work, incredibly important, and laced with lots of references to secret intelligence, the Indian Intelligence Bureau, Nehru's attitude to intelligence. I found that no scholar had really systematically interrogated that base of information, which was incredibly rich, incredibly interesting. So piecing together those sort of sources was absolutely critical. I also think being an intelligence historian, sometimes you need to be creative. So I looked at also fiction and non-fiction works. So works by John Le Carrier, for example, who was a serving officer in British Security Service, MI5, and then in British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, before he transitioned to become, a world-renowned author. Le Carrier writes often in his books, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy being a classic example, about intelligence practice in India post-1947, how the British Secret Intelligence Service worked and collaborated with Indian officials. And so I thought, well, Le Carrier knows something of the secret world. Surely this may be based on some of his first-hand knowledge. So that was also a route into exploring how fictional representations of intelligence sometimes have kernels of truth within them, which was quite interesting. And I also refer to works of non-fiction like V.S. Nepal, for example. An Area of Darkness references his travel around India in the 1960s and how he came across what he thought were CIA officers. He talks about Soviet KGB propaganda in India during the 1960s. So there's lots of fragmentary information available. And the challenge was just putting that together into a coherent narrative. It did take some time, but hopefully the book is proof that it can be done.
So, Paul, one of the things that makes this book so interesting is that it challenges the conventional wisdom in many ways, but in one of the ways by arguing that Western spy agencies like the CIA, had a transformative political, social, cultural impact, not only in Cold War Europe, where there's, I think, quite a lot been written and said, but also in the developing world. And I guess, before we kind of get into the heart of the book, I just want to ask you, why do you think it is that scholars have sort of missed out on what was happening in, what we've come to refer to as the quote unquote global South?
Thanks, Mel. That's a really excellent question. It's a question I pondered for some considerable time, actually. And I think there are several strands maybe to an answer. One of them certainly, I think, is the impact of national governments and their sort of their willingness to try and police the past. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, British officials have been quite relatively free with releasing British records on intelligence successes. And particularly I'm thinking about the Second World War, where the British ran a successful deception operation, Double Cross, against German forces in Europe. The ultra signals intelligence success, cracking German codes cracking the Enigma machine. So historians have traditionally been given access to intelligence material, official intelligence material that sort of fits in with a national narrative of intelligence success, I think. When it comes to British colonialism and the British Empire post-1945, when the story is often more complex, is often riven by political repression and violence, it's become much more difficult for historians to access that secret intelligence and security information. So, for example, I think around 2012, 2013, it became known that the British Foreign Office had kept back well over 1 million files at an institute, at a repository called Hanslope, just outside London, Hanslope Park, just outside London, which really told the secret history of British security and intelligence operations in Kenya and other places, which was a much less flattering sort of intelligence story to tell. So to some extent, I think British historians have been sort of limited by the willingness of the British government to reveal certain intelligence histories, but not others. So I think that policing of the past is significant. And to some extent, I think that's also the case in an Indian context. I think the Indian government has been very willing to release files from Indian National Archives and in other repositories about Indian national history prior to 1947, but certainly in particular areas post-1947, that willingness to release official files has been much more difficult and far more reluctance on the part of the Indian government to do so. So I know many Indian historians have commented on the fact that Indian history doesn't end in 1947. But if you'd read some Indian histories, it appears to do so. So I think that policing of the past is a significant element in that story. I think some of it is also cultural and psychological, particularly from a Western perspective. So I think many Western policymakers and Western historians have been slow to move away from the East-West, almost Cold War paradigm when looking at intelligence history. So a sort of reluctance to embrace a North-South dynamic or even a South-South dynamic when thinking about intelligence has been really present, I think, in some of the literature that's been written. And that, I think, is incredibly limiting because much of the intelligence literature that's really interesting, I think, or the intelligence story, is about a North-South story. It's about British and American intelligence liaison with states within the global South, but also about, for example, if we take the example of India, about India's relationships with other intelligence agencies within the global South is fascinating. So India, for example, was instrumental in the establishment of Ghana's first independent intelligence service in the late 1950s. And I think your guest last week, Avinash Paliwal, has written about that at some length. Also, India's connections with countries such as Cuba, with Chile, other countries in the global South is really quite significant. But that intelligence history hasn't really been written So I think partly it's to do with this cultural paradigm being stuck in an East-West sort of dynamic. I think also more prosaically, there's a third reason perhaps, and that is it's quite difficult to research for many scholars to research intelligence history within the global South. Often involves lots of travel. Logistically, it's quite challenging. There are linguistic hurdles to overcome in doing so. The archives often aren't set up in quite the way they are in Washington or London. So accessing those records can be quite challenging. It can involve long periods of time on field work. So just logistically, I think there's an issue there as well. But just because something is difficult, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And I think it's really important to emphasize there's a really rich, varied and important history when it comes to intelligence across the global South that hasn't yet been told, although I think things are beginning to improve in that domain.
Well, I want to just ask you a bit about that history, and it's not really the subject of your book per se, Paul, but you do kind of gesture at it. When we think about the Indian tradition of spycraft, you note that there has been a tradition of using espionage to uphold or support state security in India, going all the way back to the Vedic period, right, in the late Bronze Age, is something we don't really kind of think in those terms typically. Tell us a little bit about what the kind of quote-unquote intelligence scene looked like in India. What were the traditions that predated the arrival of the British Raj?
Yeah, absolutely. I think India has a very long and rich tradition of intelligence practice. So it goes all the way back to the Vedic period, as you said. I mean, I think one of the key works that established that long tradition was the rediscovery of the Artha Shastra around about the turn of the 20th century. So the Artha Shastra, that key work that dealt with which we think was written by Kautilya, who was an advisor to Mauryan emperors, going way back into the Vedic period. And that work established quite comprehensively that India had a very sophisticated and extensive intelligence networks that were operating during that period. They were documenting the running of agents, double agents, counterintelligence operations, intelligence analysis and collection, also covert action and assassination. So these key elements of modern intelligence practice were well established in the sort of Vedic period in India. And the Artha Shastra documents that quite comprehensively. And I think that's interesting because, again, there has been a bias towards intelligence being framed in a Western context. So modern intelligence practice, for example, in Britain, maybe goes back to 1909 and the creation of the Secret Intelligence Bureau, which then led to MI5, the British Domestic Security Service, and MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service. And similarly, in the United States, again, it's a relatively recent history of modern intelligence practice. The Central Intelligence Agency isn't founded until 1947 and the advent of the American National Security Act, although the Office of Strategic Services had been operating in a similar vein during the Second World War. So Western intelligence practice, in a modern sense, is relatively recent, but that sort of obscures the fact that India has a long and rich tradition going all the way back to the Vedic period, which is outlined in the Artha Shastra, but also Mughal intelligence practice in India was extensive. Lots of it networks of informers and spies that propped up the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent. So I think there's a really rich and often untold history of Indian intelligence. I think many people in the subcontinent are perhaps aware of the Artha Shastra and that sort of association with intelligence practice. But certainly outside of the Indian subcontinent, relatively little attention given to the really important contribution made by India in framing the development and the evolution of intelligence practice from ancient times right through to the present.
Trying to understand Asia is like piecing together a giant jigsaw puzzle. 40 countries and more than 2,000 languages. Asia is home to some of the fastest growing economies, and it can be incredibly hard to cover this part of the world. So we're starting the Big Take Asia, a weekly news podcast from Bloomberg. I'm Wan Ha. I've been covering Asian news for more than a decade at Bloomberg. Listen to Big Take Asia wherever you get your podcasts.
So let me now kind of fast forward a bit and ask you about the British period, but more specifically the kind of handover from the Raj to independent Indian authorities. You point out in several places that after 1947, India remained dependent on the United Kingdom to supply its armed services with senior leadership, with training, with equipment. But you point out, and I just want to quote here, in contrast to the progressive, if troubled, transfer of political power, the handover of intelligence and security responsibilities was problematic. It reinforced as much as reinvented a colonial intelligence culture shaped by fear and anxiety. So take us into that a little bit, Paul. How would you characterize the security and intelligence handover at the time of independence?
Thanks, Melania. I think it was very different from the transfer of power politically, economically, or even militarily. I mean, I think you mentioned that the military transfer of power extended from perhaps the Second World War, and it wasn't until the late 1950s, for example, that the Indian Navy had its first Indian chief. So that transfer of intelligence power from the British colonial power to the Indian state was quite protracted and quite drawn out. It took a long period of time and it was very carefully handled. And that was largely because in military terms, they needed to train Indian officers. They needed to go through a whole process of ensuring that that transfer was handled in a measured way that would make sure that Indians' national armed services were in a fit condition to defend the nation. When it came to intelligence, I think that process was handled in a much more rushed, unstructured and chaotic manner. And I think partly that was because the British were reluctant to hand over the intelligence reins of power right almost until Indian independence in August 1947, because they realized that the whole British intelligence structure was really established to focus on Indian nationalism and to guard against the sort of accumulation of power by Indian nationalists. So much of the Intelligence Bureau, the Indian Intelligence Bureau's work during the 1920s, 1930s and 1940s was targeted against very prominent Indian nationalist figures such as Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, etc., who were going to go on and assume power in the Indian state after 1947. So the British were reluctant to transfer the organs of the sort of the apparatus of intelligence power over to Indianize that process effectively, because of that structure that was based on repressing nationalism in India. Much of the archive, the intelligence archive that the British accumulated over decades and decades and decades was focused on Indian nationalists. So prior to 1947, the British effectively destroyed that intelligence archive. They burnt the institutional history of Indian intelligence effectively because it was centered on Indian nationalism. So sort of most of the intelligence records that have been really useful to a new Indian state went up in smoke in New Delhi in 1946 and 1947. So there was that sense in not establishing or leaving the structural sort of architecture in place that a new state would need. I think partition contributed to that as well. So the Indian Intelligence Service, the Intelligence Bureau, was bifurcated, was divided in two between India and Pakistan. That sort of weakened the establishment of Indian intelligence during that period as well. So the British sort of left in a hurry. They were reluctant to transfer their intelligence knowledge and intelligence practice and intelligence structure effectively to India because it had been really centered on containing Indian nationalism before 1947, I think. And because of that, we had a series of inexperienced Indian intelligence officers trying to grapple with intelligence and security problems at a really pivotal time to India when it was riven by communal violence, it was facing external threats, lots of issues that India was facing in national security terms. And the British didn't really bequeath them with a functioning intelligence service that was fit for purpose in 1947. So very problematic in terms of that. And I think because of that, that created a sense within India that they didn't really have, certainly amongst Indian policymakers, they didn't really have an intelligence service that they could meet the threats they were facing. To some extent, that explains why India was so willing to continue or to look to Britain really for intelligence and security support after 1947.
But, there was something else going on within the UK kind of state apparatus itself, which I found really interesting and maybe not that surprising given what we know about, how great powers actually work, which is almost immediately there were severe tensions within the UK government between multiple agencies involved in intelligence gathering inside of India and the surrounding neighbors. Tell us a little bit about the various actors involved, and why do you think it was that London was not able to efficiently resolve these kind of long simmering tensions which existed within British intelligence and security services?
Yeah, so it's a really good point, Bill. I think India acts as a test bed for British intelligence or British post-colonial intelligence. India in 1947 is the first major British colonial possession to transition through to independence. And the British are unsure how to handle that transfer of intelligence power. As I said, it is precipitative, it is chaotic to a large extent. But bureaucratically within the British government, there's a sort of a battle really for control over intelligence services and how they operate within India, because the British have never been through this process before, particularly, or certainly not on the same scale as they're experiencing in India. And I think in any intelligence bureaucracy, in any political bureaucracy, there's always a struggle for power. So you see that in the United States between the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You see it to some extent within India, in modern India, between the Research and Analysis Wing, the external arm of Indian intelligence, and the Intelligence Bureau, India's internal intelligence service. So I think there's institutional battles or struggles for power, for influence, for political prestige, patronage, have always been present. But I think they're particularly acute in India because the British have never come across this problem before. And certainly the British Secret Intelligence Service, commonly referred to as MI6, their remit is to operate on foreign territory. One of the complications for the British in 1947 is they're not sure if India is going to remain within the Commonwealth and therefore should be considered almost as a domestic sort of issue for the United Kingdom. And therefore the British Domestic Security Service, MI5, should have paramountcy in dealing with that, although it should be treated as a foreign power or a foreign state, and therefore the British Secret Intelligence Service should have power. So the confusion over whether India will or won't stay within the Commonwealth is really driving that bureaucratic struggle, I think. And British Secret Intelligence Service are lobbying really Whitehall, the British government at the time, saying we can't really be sure if India will stay as a British ally, it will stay within the Commonwealth. And because of that, we need to have an intelligence structure in place that treats India as a foreign power. We can't rely, for example, on India to give us the information willingly that we may need to for our own sort of strategic purposes in relation to the Indian subcontinent. So that sort of battle for power is going on during that process. I think largely because of the uncertainty over India's future and its future relationship with the United Kingdom during that power. And it's that sort of process isn't really resolved until Clement Attlee makes the decision that India will be treated effectively as MI5 sort of domain, and it stays within the Commonwealth. But there's also a bureaucratic struggle, I think, within British diplomats. So the first British High Commissioners to India, Sir Terence Shone, and his successor, Sir Archibald Nye, are not keen on having an MI6 presence in India. They're diplomats. They think that actually intelligence, or certainly secret intelligence, can complicate a nation's relationship, a diplomatic relationship. So both Nye and Shone are very sort of anti MI6 operating within India. They think the MI6 is going to be involved in espionage. It's potentially going to undertake covert action in India. That's going to alienate Nehru's government. It's going to create problems and tensions in that sort of nascent relationship, post-colonial relationship between India and the United Kingdom. And they proved right. I mean, Britain does establish a sort of proto MI6 station in India after 1947. And quite quickly, the MI6 officers that are assigned to that station are involved in activities that the Indian government finds objectionable, and they declare persona non grata, and they're asked to leave India in the late 1940s. So it's almost a vindication of British diplomats saying, India is a friend, it's an ally, it's going to stay within the Commonwealth. We don't really need to operate a secret intelligence service within India. We can work in collaboration with the Indian government. And quite quickly, the Secret Intelligence Service, Britain's MI6, is effectively barred from operating in India from the late 1940s right through until 1964 when it's reintroduced into India.
You know, one of the things that seemed to have puzzled the British for quite some time was India's approach to communism. And you sort of highlight that, look, at home, India's intelligence bureau closely monitored the operations of the Communist Party of India and its various affiliates. But when it came to foreign policy, Nehru's government sought ever closer ties to the former Soviet Union. Now, your book focuses largely on what US and UK spy agencies were doing, what they were up to, but you do touch upon in various places what Soviet spies were doing in India. Was the Indian leadership blind to Soviet intelligence activities on its soil, or did it, simply choose to sort of look the other way?
I think Nehru and Indian leaders throughout the Cold War period were very cognizant of what the Soviet Union was doing on Indian soil. So the Soviet Union was operating at various times a significant intelligence presence in Cold War India through both the KGB, but also through Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. I think at various points, Nehru became concerned at the scale of that activity. So, for example, when Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Bulganin visit India in 1955, and Nehru holds talks with the Soviet leaders. Part of that part of that process involves Nehru actually warning the Soviet leaders that he's really concerned by the amount of money and illicit funds that Moscow is channeling into the Indian Communist Party at that stage. And he explicitly tells Khrushchev, look, you need to scale back the amount of covert support you're supplying for the Indian Communist Party. We're not happy about this. It's a clear interference in India's internal affairs, and we'd like you to stop. Khrushchev throws up his hands in horror and says, well, we're not doing this. We're not funding the Indian Communist Party. Nehru knows that that's clearly nonsense. But there is a sort of exchange of views about limiting Soviet support for Indian indigenous communism. I think Nehru is well aware of what the Soviets are doing in India. I think there's a difference between Britain and the United States and the Indian government in terms of what impact that Soviet intelligence presence in India is going to have. So the Indian government, I think actually Nehru gets this right, thinks that the Soviets are operating in India. There's very little he can do to stop that. But actually, it's not making a huge difference. It's not remaking the Indian political weather. It's not having a big impact on Indian society. It's not really changing the course of Indian politics. So while the Soviets may be engaging in propaganda activity, they may be funneling funds to the Indian Communist Party and other party officials within India, it's not making a huge amount of difference, and certainly not enough difference to destabilize India's wider strategic relationship with the Soviet Union. I think Britain and the United States take a very different view to Soviet communism in India. They see it as much more pernicious, much more extensive, much more of a worrying threat and a challenge to Indian society and Indian democracy. So I think partly that's wrapped up in Cold War paranoia generally in the United States and the United Kingdom. So I think both of them appreciate there is a threat to India. I think India sees that as a very small and manageable threat that the Indian state can control, and does so relatively successfully, I think. Britain and the United States are much more concerned about that. Although within that, we have to qualify and say there are points at which both India and the United States and the United Kingdom act in concert against communism in India when they see it as a potential threat. So 1957 in Kerala would be a good example of that, where Kerala in the 1957 state elections returns one of the first democratically elected communist governments anywhere in the world. That really worries Washington. To some extent, it worries Nehru in New Delhi. And the Congress Party, there's quite a lot of evidence to support this. The Congress Party acts with the Central Intelligence Agency and other Western intelligence services to undermine the communist government in Kerala from 1957 onwards. And we know that in 1959, the communist government is sort of removed in a presidential decree. So there is covert action, a collaboration between the Indian state and external intelligence services in undermining Indian communism in southern India in the late 1950s. So when it becomes a real clear and present danger, then action is taken. But I think generally, Nehru thinks this is a threat that's containable, that's controllable, and shouldn't necessarily derail wider Indian interests, diplomatically, politically, strategically, with the Soviet Union.
There were so many ups and downs when it came to the relationship between the US, the UK, and India. And I'm referring here specifically to their kind of intelligence and security services. But there was a brief honeymoon that you document, which was kind of in the year or so after the 1962 war with China. And you write how both the US and the UK were praised, widely praised, for providing India with diplomatic and military support. But soon thereafter, Western relations with India came under new sources of strain. Tell us, why and how that honeymoon kind of ended so quickly.
I think you're absolutely right, Milan. There was a honeymoon period in the United Kingdom's and the United States' relationship with India after 1962. Obviously, India suffers an unexpected attack from China in 1962 across its northern border. Huge psychological impact in India because of that attack. And India looks to the West to provide military and diplomatic support in the face of this onslaught from communist China. And very quickly, the United States, the United Kingdom airlift military supplies into India. They provide unstinting diplomatic support and political support for the Indian state. But India, after the shock of 1962 has worn off, really has a conception of having to expand India's military capacity substantially. So to rapidly expand the size of the Indian army, to rapidly develop the capabilities and the size of the Indian Air Force. And that comes with a huge bill. And the United Kingdom and the United States are willing to some extent to underwrite Indian national security. But their conception of what that will involve in terms of scale and also critically in terms of cost differs quite substantially from that of the Nehru government. So we have a disconnect between the United States and the United Kingdom saying, we will support you with the military aid up until to this extent. And the Indian government saying, that's fine, but it's nowhere near what we actually expect you to provide. And our ambitions in terms of our national security and the expansion of the Indian military go far beyond what the United States and the United Kingdom think is practicable and also necessary. So one of the key factors, I think, that erodes or creates that friction is both the United States and the United Kingdom think the Indian economy cannot bear will essentially implode if the Indian government tries to expand its military capacity so quickly and so extensively after 1962. So there's a disconnect on the scale of the Chinese threat that's facing India and what the response to that should be. So partly military aid is important in 1962, but the failure of the United States and the United Kingdom to match India's expectations around the scale of aid that will be delivered from Washington and London in 1963 and 1964 builds up tensions between the two, I think. We then see Pakistan coming into the equation as well. So the United States and the United Kingdom are conscious that if they give India the amount of military aid that India is looking for, that will destabilize their relationship with Pakistan. So neither the United Kingdom or the United States want that to happen. So that delicate balance that's always been the case with the United States and the United Kingdom invariably during the Cold War period of wanting to balance their relationship with India against their relationship with Pakistan really acts as a brake on a military aid coming into India. Again, provides another source of tension. I think by the time we get to 1965 and the eruption of conflict again between India and Pakistan, initially over the Run of Kutch, but then separately over Kashmir, the fact that Britain and the United States are not seen to back India as forcefully as the Indian state would like. Harold Wilson, famously the British Prime Minister at the time, appears to blame India for military aggression in 1965. That goes down incredibly badly in New Delhi. So lots of sort of bumps in the road by 1965. I think the death of John F. Kennedy is significant. Kennedy's been a big supporter of India diplomatically and militarily after 1962. Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, who assumes presidency when Kennedy's assassinated in 1963. Johnson doesn't have the same empathy for India. He doesn't have the same emotional connection to India. He doesn't geopolitically think India is as important as John F. Kennedy thinks India is. And by that point in 1965, Johnson's pivoting away to Vietnam as well and away from South Asia. So I think I've argued previously that in 1962, the Kennedy administration, when it looks at Asia, sees India as by far the most important country in Asia and the most important priority of the United States. By the time we get to 1965, that priority is shifted away from India towards Vietnam, towards Southeast Asia under the Lyndon Johnson administration. And that creates tensions within India as well. So I think lots of reasons that by 1965, the West is tilting away from India. Moscow is tilting towards India. But just a symbol of that, I think, is the fact that in 1965, when the sort of, or early 1966, January 1966, when peace negotiations are held that end the conflict between India and Pakistan that's erupted in 1965. Those peace negotiations are not held in London. They're not held in Washington. They're held in the Central Asian Soviet city of Tashkent. So I think that's a symbolic sort of signal that the Soviet Union is becoming closer to India by the mid-1960s, and the West is moving away from India during that period. So lots of reasons, I think.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. You know, there are multiple examples, Paul, in your book of collaboration between U.S., U.K. intelligence services and their Indian counterparts. I just want to ask you to elaborate on one, because it was something that was new to me and what proved to be a source of controversy over time, which was that there was some kind of secret facility in the Nanda Devi range of the Himalayas set up by India in conjunction with the CIA. Tell us a little bit about what that was and what sort of outrage or controversy it provoked once the facts around it came to light.
Yes, thanks, Milan. It's a really interesting episode, I think, in Indian intelligence history. So after 1962, obviously, India was very concerned about the strategic threat posed to the state by China. And of course, China goes on to test its nuclear weapon in October 1964. And there's tremendous pressure that's placed on the Indian government not to go down the path of nuclear proliferation, not to develop its own nuclear weapon to counteract the nuclear capacity that's been developed by the People's Republic of China. So one of the ways the United States offers support to India to offset that Chinese nuclear threat is to propose an operation that's called Operation HAT, which is to place two nuclear-powered sensors on two peaks in the Himalayas, Nanda Devi and Nanda Kot, which will monitor Chinese nuclear test ranges and missile ranges just over the Himalayan border. So it's the CIA saying to India, we will give you cutting-edge intelligence collection capabilities so you can monitor the evolution of China's nuclear program and its intercontinental missile program as well. So to give India reassurance about how quickly, how extensively that program is developing over time. Controversy is those nuclear monitoring devices are placed on the top of one's placed on the top of Nanda Devi, and one of them is lost in transit getting to the top of that mountain. The devices are put in place by a joint team of American and Indian mountaineers, and the Indian Intelligence Bureau, the Central Intelligence Agency, conduct that operation as a joint endeavour. So both the Indian government and the American government are witting to that operation. They've approved it, they've authorised it. The problem comes when one of the nuclear devices is lost. It falls into a crevasse as it's being hauled up to the top of the mountain, and it's unrecoverable. So they just have to leave it behind effectively. But it contains a nuclear isotope, which is troubling. Several rescue attempts are mounted in the late 1960s to try and recover that nuclear isotope, largely because there's concern it might leak, it might become corroded, and then nuclear material might get into the headwaters of the Ganges, which is obviously going to be really problematic. But unfortunately, it's unsuccessful. They can't recover that nuclear isotope. The story then goes dead. Intelligence cooperation between India and the United States sort of peters out really by the late 1960s, early 1970s. But in 1978, an American investigative journalist uncovers this story. He finds out about this operation that's been mounted, covert operation that's been mounted in the 1960s, and he breaks the story in a West Coast magazine in the United States. The magazine's called Outside in 1978. and it creates a furore. It's one of those examples where blowback or these sort of unintended negative consequences of intelligence action comes back many years or many decades later to become a problem. So the Indian government thought it had dealt with this problem, it compartmentalized it, it's something that had gone away. And then a journalist breaks the story in 1978. It makes headlines in India, of course. There's a sort of a big uproar in the Indian parliament about the fact that the United States appears to have mounted a nuclear device on one of India's Himalayan peaks. Lots of Indian politicians think this operation must have been conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency without the knowledge of the Indian government. So there's lots of charges of CIA interference in India, a foreign hand, that sort of narrative again. But interestingly, by that point, the operation has been conducted under the administration of, Lal Bahadur Shastri to start with, but then Indira Gandhi. But by 1978, of course, Morarji Desai is in power in India and his Janata coalition are in power. And so they, because effectively they're not responsible for the actions that have been taken in the early 1960s when they're not in power, Morarji Desai makes a really interesting decision to be completely open and transparent and candid with the Indian people about what has actually happened. So he goes before the Indian Parliament and says, absolutely, this intelligence operation took place. The Indian government knew about this intelligence operation. It was a joint operation with the Indian Intelligence Bureau and the Central Intelligence Agency. We were cooperating with the United States at that point because it was in our national security interest to do so because of the present clear and present danger from China. Unapologetic about having done that. So it's quite an open and candid sort of mea culpa on the part of the Indian government about what had happened in terms of this covert intelligence operation in the 1960s and how it had gone wrong. I think partly that's facilitated by the fact that the Janata government, of course, weren't in power at the time. So therefore, they could sort of point to the Congress government as approving that operation. But it does create a tremendous political storm in India. I think one of the key lessons from that, however, is that it would have been very easy for the Indian government to try and cover up that operation, not to talk about it, to not comment on the intelligence operation. And I think that would have fueled the sense of concern, anger within India, would fuel a sense of conspiracism around the Central Intelligence Agency in India. But I think Morarji Desai actually handles that in a really, really effective way by being very transparent and very open. And because of that, the story dies quite quickly. The Indian people have to accept that this operation's happened. There's a clear national security rationale for it having taken place. Some people are uncomfortable that India's cooperated with the Central Intelligence Agency at the time, but the sort of story doesn't really gain much traction within the Indian press and sort of dies away quite quickly. So perhaps one of the example where being quite candid and open about past intelligence failures or intelligence operations works politically to the benefit of the Indian government at that point.
You know, former U.S. ambassador to India, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, kind of a famous public intellectual and politician ambassador, he wrote in a book that he authored that the CIA had twice, but only twice, interfered directly in India's domestic affairs by covertly funneling money to Indian political parties. What do we know about these allegations and how credible are they? I mean, presumably Moynihan would be in a position to know.
Yes. So I think they are credible. And Moynihan, it's interesting actually, because Moynihan, when he was ambassador to India, Richard Nixon appoints him ambassador to India in the early 1970s. And Moynihan is not particularly a fan of the Central Intelligence Agency. Some of your listeners may know that when Moynihan serves subsequently as senator for the state of New York, at the end, during this coincides with the end of the Cold War period, Moynihan is one of the most prominent American politicians that actually calls for the CIA to be disbanded at the end of the Cold War and says there's really no rationale. We've defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There's really no need for the Central Intelligence Agency to operate, at least in its current form, post the end of the Cold War. So Moynihan has always been had a healthy suspicion about the value of intelligence and secret intelligence, particularly as a sort of as an arm of the United States government, particularly when it comes to international diplomacy. And when he is ambassador to India in the 1970s, this is a period where the Indira Gandhi government is accusing the Central Intelligence Agency of interference in Indian domestic affairs. There's a big narrative about the foreign hand in India and how the CIA is trying to subvert Indian democracy and undermine Gandhi's administrations. So Moynihan sees firsthand the problems that intelligence can create politically in a country where an intelligence service has an invidious reputation for intervening in another country's external affairs. So Moynihan's not a great fan of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they complicate his life significantly when he's trying to establish good diplomatic relations with India during his tenure. So Moynihan looks into, because of this background, and Moynihan is constantly assailed by comments from Indian journalists that the CIA is up to no good in India. It's because of that, really, that Moynihan conducts an inquiry about what the CIA has actually done in India. And he finds out that, looking back through the agency files, looking back through the embassy's files, that it appears that on only 2 occasions, the Central Intelligence Agency has tried to interfere in Indian domestic politics, principally by funneling money to political parties that it favours within India. On neither of those occasions has it made any major difference. The intervention is not significant enough in terms of the amount of money that's involved or the number of candidates that money is funneled to make a huge difference. So it seems as though this is really a bit of a storm in a teacup. I think the story is credible because an earlier US ambassador, John Kenneth Galbraith, has been John F. Kennedy's ambassador to India in the 1960s, has written about a similar sort of process. So in Galbraith's memoirs, he comments on the fact that when he arrived in India, he undertook a similar exercise to see what the Central Intelligence Agency had been doing in India. Again, Galbraith, another skeptic really when it came to the Central Intelligence Agency and how they would complicate his life as an ambassador in India. Galbraith comes to a similar conclusion that very rarely has the CIA actually become involved in Indian internal politics. And when it has done, the intervention is on such a small scale that it's not enough to actually tilt the balance of Indian politics in any particular direction, but it's more than enough to create a political storm and to complicate an ambassador's life. So Galbraith thinks this is completely counterproductive and reflects upon that in his memoirs. So lots of evidence from different American ambassadors and politicians that this has in fact taken place, but that not on a substantive scale and not on a scale that's really going to make any difference in terms of Indian politics. And it's probably useful to say that this is not the United States alone indulging in this sort of behaviour. Very well documented, the Mitrokhin archive. KGB historian Vasily Mitrokhin defected to the West, brought some papers with him when he did so. Mitrokhin papers establish as well quite comprehensively that the Soviet state and the KGB and the GRU was also heavily involved in bribing or at least funneling money to Indian politicians from the 1950s onwards. And again, very little evidence that made a huge difference. Very little evidence that it was significant enough in terms of the financial sums involved to really change domestic politics in India. So I think both sides of the Cold War spectrum, the Soviet Union and the United States, were trying to intervene in Indian domestic politics at certain times, but not really having a big effect. I think, interestingly, where they do have an effect is in 1957 in Kerala, where the CIA does effectively undermine the communist government in Kerala, but it does so in partnership with the ruling Congress Party. So when the United States and its intelligence agencies work with the Indian government covertly, that can be effective. And I think 1957 is an example where that collaboration works in undermining and removing a communist government in the state of Kerala. Where the United States tries to do it without partnership, not about working in collaboration with the Indian government, it's relatively unsuccessful. So I think certainly there is strong evidence that both the United States and the Soviet Union were active in some form in interfering in Indian domestic affairs, but to no great impact, I think.
So, Paul, let me just kind of bring this to an end by asking you to reflect on a kind of really big picture question, which in some ways is the kind of, one of the big takeaways from your book. In the concluding chapter, you write that the overt policy objectives and interests of both British and American governments in India weren't materially advanced by the prosecution of a secret Cold War in the subcontinent. And earlier in the book, you say, and I just want to quote here, Cold War interventions undertaken by British and American intelligence and security agencies in India proved to be misguided and largely self-defeating. Just to kind of wrap things up, in your judgment, why did these efforts fail and fail so badly?
Yeah, I think they failed because they were misconceived. And I think they failed because it would have been very difficult. I think intelligence agencies generally, particularly when they're mounting covert action operations, I don't think they're capable of making the political weather often in any national context. So they may be force amplifiers, they may be able to nudge the political dial slightly in a particular direction, but they're not going to change. I think they're ever powerful enough to change the fundamental strategic economic drivers or political drivers of a particular country. So I think intelligence has a limited capacity to impact political developments in any nation state, but certainly in a nation state that's as large, as populous, as diverse, as ethnically, linguistically, culturally complex as India. It would be a huge task for any intelligence service to do that. So I think Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union were really taking on a challenge they didn't have the capacity in intelligence terms to meet. It was just too big an issue to draw. I think often they undertook intelligence action because they thought it was better to do something rather than do nothing. So this notion of being active and trying to affect events was something that was really, that competition between the two sides of the Cold War was driving their actions in India. But I don't think it had any real impact. I mean, interesting when we think about, we haven't touched on it today, but the Information Research Department, the big covert British propaganda arm, which was very active in India from the late 1940s through to the mid-1970s, probably the biggest covert operation mounted by the United Kingdom in Cold War India, involved relatively significant amounts of money and effort by the British state. When the Information Research Department sort of time in India came to an end, when it was wound up in the late 1970s, the British government asked for some assessment of what it achieved in India. And it was very difficult for the IRD to point to anything concrete or substantive that its 20-year covert involvement in India had actually achieved. And I think that's because it's just so difficult to change the structural dynamics of the Indian state during that period. So intelligence, I think, in some ways was never going to be able to make a big impression in India. I think the legacy it did leave, which is really important, was to do with corrupting the political culture of India to some extent. So by fueling conspiracism, by fueling a narrative of a foreign hand, by fueling a narrative about the potentiality of internal interference by a foreign intelligence service, out of all proportion to what it could actually achieve. I think that was the big legacy, and that I think has proved quite politically toxic. So in concrete terms, I don't think they achieved much. I think much of what they actually achieved was counterproductive by fueling a sense of conspiracism and political corruption, which has been deeply unhelpful, I think, to Indian politics really since the end of the Cold War.
My guest on the show this week is Paul McGarr. He's a lecturer in intelligence studies at King's College London. He's author of the new book, Spying in South Asia, Britain, the United States, and India's Secret Cold War. Richard Aldrich, who's at the University of Warwick, has this to say about the book. He calls Spying in South Asia a major contribution to the international history of the 20th century. The scale of the research is awe-inspiring. The arguments are compelling. The narrative is gripping. This is a masterly piece of work. Paul, I can hardly say it better than Richard Aldrich, but this was a terrific book. I learned so much. A lot of masala in here, actually, that given how much spies and spy agencies are in the news, I think readers will find quite intriguing and interesting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Belen. It's been a pleasure.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.